We're live.
Calling Chris Anderson in London.
This is Chris Anderson in London, calling Rick Beyer in Chicago. How are you?
I am excellent. Beautiful day here in Chicago. How about there?
Oh, it's sunny and 70 here in London. It's gorgeous.
That's the one day of the year that
It's
we
the one
get
day
that.
we've had it, got that out of the system now, and we can move
That's
on.
fabulous. Yeah. So
Yes.
we'll wait for a moment for people to join us to get started for real. And please let us know you're here. And of course, History Happy Hour is brought to you with the support and assistance of Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours. And we're here talking about history every Sunday at 4 p.m. Eastern. Anybody with us, Chris, today?
Yes, we've got John from Toronto. And John, I want to thank you for that information that you sent me on some Canadian stuff, which made me very, very happy. And Wally and Valerie from Normandy and Xavier. Hey, Xavier, how are you? Doreen. I haven't seen Marcus yet, though. I'm getting a little nervous.
I don't know. Maybe Marcus is on a little Memorial Day vacation this
He
weekend.
may be. He may be.
If we are ready,
Is
Chris,
it
we
time?
can begin. What do you think?
Okay, you ready?
Give us the drum roll.
Thank you. The
Yeah.
bar is open.
Chris, before we introduce our guest today, we
Yes.
want to remember, of course, that it is Memorial Day, a time when we honor those soldiers who sacrificed their lives for our country. And this is some footage that was shot this morning at the American Cemetery in Luxembourg. Thank you to Tim Lone for getting this for us. And that was the grave of Ghost Army soldier George Peddle, who is buried in this cemetery alongside 5,075 other Americans, most killed in the Battle of the Bulge.
Yep, and I would like to kind of pause for a second and think of the five members of Easy Company who are there with their comrades. And when this is all over, I'm far away from home, but I'm going to do what I do every Memorial Day, and I'm going to read For the Fallen by Lawrence Binion. And that'll be how I think of all you guys, wherever you are.
So yeah, we honor and thank those veterans, of course, who gave the ultimate sacrifice here on Memorial Day. Um, so now we want to move on to today's topic, and I want you to imagine that you are growing up Jewish in Hitler's Germany. Somehow you managed to get out. You're a young man, and you're a stateless refugee, not exactly welcomed by the British government, especially after the war with Germany breaks out. But after going down kind of a tortuous road, you end up with a new name and identity and a job as an elite British commando. And that's the story we're going to talk about today. A group of men who went through that exact journey. It's just an incredible World War II story. And our guest today is Leah Garrett, who is the author of the book X Troop, The Elite British Commandos of World War II. It's a slightly different title in the UK, where it's the Elite British Commandos who beat the Nazis. And Dr. Garrett is director of the Jewish Studies Center and director of Hebrew and Jewish Studies at Hunter College, and she is the award-winning author of 4 books on Jewish literary history and numerous essays and articles. Leah, welcome to History Happy Hour.
Thank you so much. I'm very pleased to be here, especially on Memorial Day, to talk about these incredible men who we'll discuss
Yeah.
today.
And we do have to ask, it is History Happy Hour. Did you bring a cocktail?
I'm in Peekskill for the week, so some local Peekskill
Ah, very
very,
nice.
very delicious.
Excellent. I have a two-hearted ale, so I don't know what
And
the
I
significance
have
of that
water
is.
because I'm getting over my celebrations last night.
All right,
I
TMI, TMI, Chris, TMI.
TMI, I know.
Leah, this is a great story that you've written about, and one that I didn't know anything about. And I wonder if you could tell us how you came across the story of the commandos who made up X Troop, and what made you want to write about it.
So my last book was on Jewish American GIs in World War II, particularly those who became famous writers like Norman Mailer and Henry Wook and Joseph Heller. And when I finished that book, I thought, okay, I've gotten World War II out of my system. Even though I grew up in a family where my grandfather, all my great uncles, everyone served in World War II, and it was just really essential to my childhood. And I'm also married to somebody whose husband served in Iraq and in Afghanistan. So I'm around a lot of military people. But after I wrote that book, I thought I've got it out of my system. I'm going to write a book on Mad Magazine. And so that was the plan. I interviewed a lot of the older generation of Mad Magazine. And then I went one day while I thought I was working on that book to the Center for Jewish History, where they were showing this documentary called G.I. Jew that I had been interviewed for. And after I watched the documentary, I got on the subway train going to Upper West Side where we live. And I thought, no, I'm still obsessed with World War II. I need to tell more stories. I need to keep writing about this.
That's not something that either of us has any understanding of whatsoever.
It's really deep, and I cannot get rid of it. So I started to try and find a topic, and I sort of saw on the internet these sort of mentions of a secret Jewish commando unit, and I kept looking, and I had this glorious day one day where I looked for a book about them, and I thought, holy crap, nobody's written that book. I get to write that book. Wow, that's crazy. And so from there, I started digging, and I got in touch with one child of a commando, which led to like all these networks of the kids of commandos. It also led to finding out that there were still living commandos. And I started to go to archives, the Imperial War Museum, the National Archive at Kew, Holocaust Museum, World War II Museum. And I found this astonishing wealth of material. It was like this book was waiting for somebody to come along and write it. And because I think the families every single family was extraordinarily generous towards me, which meant that I also found all these family archives as well. So once I discovered that I got to be the one to write it, it went very quickly with a huge wealth of material, just so much material that was just waiting for somebody to write about. And so I got to write it.
It's wonderful. It's kind of ironic given how secret they were that there is this, cache of information that was fortunately just waiting for you.
Yeah.
But just I think for Americans and I know there's lots and lots of different stories, but roughly how is it that these young men find themselves in Great Britain, and what's the reaction to the British people to them and to other Jews who are able to get out?
Well, so I tell the story of the entire troop, which was 87 men, but I focus quite a bit on 3 and then more broadly on about 10 of them. And every single story of every single ex-trooper was one of profound loss and terror. One of the men I focus on, Colin Anson, was raised in a middle-class family in Germany. He didn't even know he was Jewish because his parents protected him from it with the rise of Nazism. And he was sitting with his dad at a pub having a beer when he was just a teenager, and the police took his dad away and killed him at Dachau. And so his mom responded by putting him on a train outside of Germany, because at this point, Jews have nowhere to go. Adult Jews have nowhere to go. But the UK has set up this program where they're going to take youth and children, Jewish kids. So the majority of them, almost every single one, comes by himself as a teenager, 15, 16, 17, 18 years old, often on these kinder transport. And they get there and, their parents have made the ultimate sacrifice and they think that they're safe. And they start to, some go to college, some go to Oxford. And then when war breaks out, infamously, Churchill does something that's called Color the Lot, where there was a lot of agitation in the British press about potentially a 5th column of Germans who were enemies, very similar here to the Japanese. And they make the decision to call all of the German refugees and Austrian refugees are now called enemy aliens. And then they start to look through the enemy aliens and decide that if you're sort of a young male German, you're potentially very dangerous. And so they rounded up about 7,000 of these German refugees, 3/4 of which were Jewish. and they put them in internment camps. Pretty bad internment camps. Some bad in the UK, some absolutely horrific in Australia and in Canada. So for the boys of X Troop, basically every single one ends up starts in Germany or Austria, is put by himself on a train, gets to the UK as a teenager, is rounded up and interred, often for up to a year. And then they're told, look, you can leave internment camp if you join the Pioneer Corps, which is part of the military. And they love the idea of joining the military because these boys want to get back and fight. Right. But in the Pioneer Corps, you're not allowed to have arms. And it's just heavy labor, digging holes, and so on and so forth. So they're all there for a few months. And then what happens is Churchill and Lord Mountbatten realize that they need to do something pretty radical because, 1942, it's really going poorly for the British.
Bad year. It was a bad year.
Really bad year. And they already have commandos, but they decide what they're going to do is create something called Inter-Allied 10 Commando. And it's going to be made of troops that have a lot of rage towards the Nazis because the Nazis have invaded their home country. So there's a Polish troop, French troop, and then they decide that they're also going to create a special troop of German speakers, which is the X Troop, who it will turn out will almost entirely be Jewish. And there's the X Troop. That's the only group photo we have of them while they're training in Wales. And so they take all of these German Jewish refugees who are itching to fight. It's the greatest thing in the world that they're given this opportunity. MI5 interviews them. They pick the best of the best. And they decide to do something very unique with them, which is not only train them to be commandos, but also to train all of them to be counterintelligence officers. So people have been asking me, how do they relate to the Ritchie boys in the United States? Sure. Also German exiles.
You must have seen that on my question list.
Oh, it wasn't?
So, thanks a lot. Now what am I going to ask at that point?
But the Ritchie boys are just counterintelligence. I'm sorry, but I love my X Troops. So the X Troopers are not only counterintelligence, they are tough, deeply trained commandos. So the idea is they're not only going to kill and capture the enemy, right, with knowing every type of weapon, attacking from the front, everything a commando does. But then, because of their German language and counterintelligence training, they're going to interrogate the captured prisoners on the field. No one had ever done this before. You always bring them back to base. They're going to interrogate them there. They're going to get intel that will help the battle continue in that moment. So it's really unique. Just last point on it, and I'll be quiet. Because the group is top secret, their commanding officer is this amazing Welshman called Brian Hilton Jones, which is him, the dapper Brian Hilton Jones. And he makes the decision, which was the right decision, that they had to protect their identities. Because if they're captured, they're not only going to be killed on sight as commandos, because Hitler had a commando edict, but as Jews and as Germans. And their families back over there may be killed too. So each of them also has to take on a fake British name, persona, British dog tags that say Church of England. So it's a crazy story. I mean, it's just completely nuts. And then they send them out and they are the tip of the spear in basically every battle.
I want to circle back a little bit to the time before X Troop is formed, and we'll come back to X Troop. But I was quite fascinated by the way that so many, not just the X Troop boys and men were treated, but the way that so many of the Jewish refugees were treated, because I think a lot of us probably have this image that they're welcomed with open arms once they get outside of Germany, and of course once they get to England, and it's not quite the case. And in particular, and I'd like to ask you about it, but there's this awful voyage that many of them are forced to make to Australia on a ship called the Daenerys, which is quite horrible. And I'm going to ask you about that, but first I want to read a quote from one person who was on that ship, who I don't believe was one of the X Troop, but was a refugee, Walter Freud, who was Sigmund Freud's grandson, who said, "We were thrown out of Germany on threat of death, and when we thought we had found a new home in England, we were again thrown out unceremoniously. The earth did not seem to have a single spot where we could live undisturbed." Tell us a little bit about the Daenerys and the people who went to Australia and kind of what happened there, because it's just an amazing story all by itself.
And I actually found his journal in the Imperial War Museum, which was incredible. And it's never been published, but I read it because he was on the Daenerys. And also when I wrote the book, there was still 2 commandos who were alive, and one of them had been on the Daenerys. So I actually interviewed him for the book. So when they come over and then they do this whole collar the lot thing, the vast majority of those who are locked, of the 7,000 or so who are locked up, are locked up on the Isle of Man and in a number of internment camps around the UK. And they're all pretty bad, right? But the Jews there find a way to respond. They like create newspapers and like soccer games. Like they respond and try and make life as normal as possible. But for those who are sent to Australia, it's a completely different story, because a number of the X troopers it's very random. It's just they take enough to fill a ship of these Germans, and they put them out, they take them to the ship. And as they get on the ship, these are all very, very traumatized people who have just lost their entire families to the Nazis. And a lot of them would have like a photograph of their mom or a journal from, that they'd kept, or a letter from their dad, or their wedding ring or whatever it was. And as they get on the ship, the British crew throws everything they have overboard. So now they've lost everything. And a number of them fought back. They just beat the crap out of them. And they put them into the hold deep down. There's a bunch of German prisoners of war who get the nicer areas on the ship. And then the ship heads, and this is when, the Germans are bombing ships, all the way to Australia with this hundreds of these Jewish German refugees in the hold. And the really bad luck, on top of all that other bad luck, is that it was an infamously anti-Semitic British crew who were in charge. They were all court-martialed afterwards, by the way, when the information got out. And they weren't given water or air. I mean, it's absolutely horrific. That the commando I interviewed told me about the way, and I'd read about this, but then he told me this actually did happen, that the crew would throw broken glass onto the deck and make these German Jewish refugees run across it barefoot as fun. I mean, that was the basically typical of the whole journey. So they get to Australia.
I mean, that's what you expect the Nazis to be doing at,
It's awful. Yeah. And German prisoners of war join the British crew in all the torture. So it's beyond horrific. And there's tons of archival material from this that needs to be aired more, I think. Anyway, so they get to Australia, and then they decide to put them all on these trains and send them to the basically middle of nowhere of the outback, and to this camp, this internment camp. As one of them said, there was barbed wire there, but nobody's. There's nowhere to go. Like, you're in the outback. I mean, I lived in Australia for 10 years. I know the outback. There's nowhere to go. And the worst part for them, though, was that they don't allow them to have any newspaper or information. And these guys, maybe their mom could potentially still be alive in, I don't know, in Luxembourg, whatever, wherever they are. And for a year, they don't get any news. They're just stuck there. And then finally, the British send somebody over after the Australians do a report of the horrific commission. And then the news comes out and the guys are all court-martialed. And then they start to send them back. And one of the boats going back is bombed. A bunch of them die, but the rest make it back and join the X Troop.
So
wow,
they're back, and they're still interned. So there are still a lot of Jews and people from Germany who have been locked up by the British, and they say, hey, you can help out by digging a lot of ditches,
right?
And they volunteer for that. And I would imagine, as young men who've been through all this, they're a little eager to get into the fight. How are the 87? How are they selected? How do they kind of get to where they go?
Okay, so they are desperate to get in the fight. All of them say, we filled like our commanding officer's mailbox. Please let me out. One of them even does gets tested to be an RAF pilot and passes, but they won't let him go because he's an enemy alien. They're doing everything they can to get out of there. And then these little notices start to appear on the boards in their dorm or wherever, saying, we need volunteers for special hazardous duty. And, the regular members of the Pioneer Corps have no interest, because the Pioneer Corps is where they send people who they consider physically worthless, basically people who have no strength, who are alcoholics, whatever it is. Ex-criminals all go there. But all of these German Jewish refugees are like, yes. So they start responding, and they have them all come to London at this old hotel in Marylebone, and MI5 is there, and they start interviewing them, and they're looking for, I would say, three things. Physical adeptness is hugely important, and Pioneer Corps had like running competitions, all these things. So they're standouts. They have to be standouts physically. They have to be, because they're going to be commandos and counterintelligence, they got to be brilliant. They also, though, have to have a burning desire to get back to Nazi Germany and fix this world. So it was sort of like a threefold thing. And then amongst this, they picked the best of the best. And as one of them said in a memoir his daughter shared with me that hasn't been public, he said it was completely ridiculous because I walked into the interview room being told that as an enemy alien, I couldn't be trusted to carry anything more serious than a pickaxe. And I'm walking out of the room being told that I'm going to be part of the most like elite commando unit of World War II. And I think he said something like what boy wouldn't be excited by that? So they're looking for a very sort of specific.
Right. Yeah.
And then once they pass their way, they still have to do about a year of training after that.
Yeah, and I that must be, was that Peter Masters who you were quoting there? I mean, you quote him in the book, one of the commandos, who said, first you were a hate object, then if you were lucky and not killed, you were a refugee, then you were a farmhand. These were all things I'd never dreamt about being. And
Yeah.
After that, you became a soldier in the Pioneer Corps without weapons, and now comes the ultimate transformation, like a butterfly out of a cocoon to the elite of the elite. I mean, it is a kind of a. I mean, World War II is an era and a topic with a lot of astonishing kind of moments and transformations, but that is a particularly unusual and intense one.
Yeah, and for Peter Masters, who's one of the ones I really focus heavily on, and his family has been so generous to help me write this book. He was from this like lovely middle-class family in Vienna. He was an artist. He rode his bike everywhere. He went to soccer games. So this whole way his world turned upside down was completely head spinning for him. And he wasn't particularly physically adept. And when the sign appeared on the board where he was, he started to do long distance running training because he knew he had to get in shape for this. And there's another great quote in the book where he says something like, no one would ever believe that this boy from Vienna can now sit there with a blindfold around his eye and take apart a Colt 45 in like 30 seconds or something. So they were as astonished by the transformation as anyone was that they were able to do this. Some of them were very capable from the get-go, but a number of them, they were like intellectual. There was a woman who billeted with them who was married to one of them, Miriam Rothschild, and she said this quote, which I think kind of sums it all up. She said, I can't remember the exact words, but it was something like, with your standard British soldier, they might be talking about like football and beer. But with these guys, I'd walk with them and they'd be talking about Schopenhauer. So there you go.
Yeah. Well,
was he a football player?
No, but he wanted to be. He wanted to
be a football player.
That's right. Yeah. And he wanted to play for Arsenal.
Yeah, that's right.
Why would he want to do that?
My husband would say Liverpool, but there you go.
Oh, well, yeah, there's medicine for that. Anyway. So, but I think one of the things that I find so moving and poignant about the story is the fact that while they're going through all this and they're volunteering and this whole experience, they have to completely hide their identity. And I'd like you to talk a little bit about that and maybe explain how they dealt with that, right? To just almost have to deny who you are.
Yeah. Well, it was extremely hard because when they had to do the name changes, they were given it. And again, the Brian Home Jones was wonderful. It was just because of expediency. It wasn't cruelty. They were basically given 5 minutes to all come up with new names, right? Like Colin Anson picked the name Anson because he saw an Anson airplane fly above him at that moment. And his kids and grandkids are all Ansons now. So they only had a few minutes to do this change. They had to remember their new names, which was hard, and everyone else's new names too, because the minute they went on the train to go to Wales for the training, they all had to be these new people, right? They all were given fake regimental badges. They all pretended they were different with different regiments. Um, the one of the men I focus on, Montfort Gans, was the only one of the group, as far as I could tell, who was actually Orthodox Jewish. So he came from a religious background, a very strong, wonderful family in Germany, and he was religious. And I talked to his kids about it because, for him to transform into commando, it also meant like not keeping kosher, not doing any Jewish religious rituals. And when he'd been in internment camp, he had said to other people in the internment camp, I'm going to get out of here and I'm going to fight the Nazis. And he hung out with all these Orthodox guys. And one of them said, you can't do that. You'll break the rules of Judaism. And another guy who he really admired said, it's a mitzvah to fight and kill Nazis. So he was like, okay. So I talked to his kids about it because for him, he had to shed everything to do this transformation. And they said to me, you would have thought it would have been hard, but he was so determined to beat the Nazis, he would do whatever it took. And I think that idea of, we know there's a clock ticking. We know we still have family in Germany and Austria. We know the sooner we win the war, potentially maybe we can save one distant cousin or a sister or whatever it is. We will do whatever it takes. But it was really hard. Like when they were with the Welsh villagers, I heard these interviews with the Welsh villagers after they stayed with them. And one of them said, all of us would say to each other that the commanders would always say, we would say to them, where are you from? And they'd say, we are English. So like, they did their best. They did all have backstories, by the way, really deep backstories about their accents. But I think, honestly, in the larger scheme of things, as hard as it was, it must have also been like an amazing distraction to have all this stuff to focus on because you're not thinking about what's happening to your family over there too. Yeah.
And this has just come in and it ties into what we've just been asking. One question was, how did they conceal their accents and dialects? And I guess I'm assuming that a strong command of English had to have been a requirement to join the unit, right?
They had a fairly strong command at this point because all of them have been now over for about 3 years, because they've gone through the Pioneer Corps and internment. But they still had accents. So like I said, they all had these backstories. Like my nanny was German. The typical one was my dad was a businessman and I grew up in Germany. So they all had backstories there. But you have to remember that besides Montfort Gans, who's Orthodox, right? The vast majority of them are from like really assimilated middle-class families. So they're not Jewish religiously. They're more, they are, but not really. They're more Jewish in terms, that's how the Nazis define.
Culturally.
Culturally. Yeah.
Yeah. So I would like to remind everybody, first of all, that we're talking to Leah Garrett, who is the author of the book X Troop, The Secret Jewish Commandos of World War II. And we do welcome your questions. And thanks to Matt and Skip, I think we answered your question already about their command of the English language, which was, I'm sure, improving as time went by, but maybe not always on top of things right away. One of the, maybe not the earliest thing that they were involved in, but one of the things that they were involved in is a subject that we have discussed before on this show, the Dieppe raid. And you suggest that that some of these commandos who were there, and they were broken up, right? They were broken up into different groups who had to serve with different units, that they who were involved with the Dieppe raid, that they may have been there with a very specific mission to try to grab an Enigma machine. So talk a little bit about the X Troop soldiers who were there as part of the Dieppe raid.
Okay, so once these boys were being trained, it quickly became apparent to the British military that these guys were like a superhuman weapon. And they made a decision with the X Troop that they didn't make with any other commando units, was that they were far too valuable to fight alone as a unit, because look, if there's a roadside bomb, it could wipe out half of them. So they made this very unusual decision that they would only parcel them out in 2s and 3s and 4s to existing commando units, so they could be like the leaders of other commando units. And so what happens in Dieppe is 5 of them are chosen at the, just like a week before the Dieppe raid. And what seems to have happened is SOE decides that they need some German speakers. So they're sent along to Dieppe. And I was really curious, like, that's really strange. At this point, it's clear these guys are really valuable. It's a really dangerous raid. Of course, we all know that it turned out to be terrible, with scores and scores of allies dead. A terrible, terrible moment in World War II history. But I kept thinking it's very bizarre that they had to have these German speakers to go on the raid. And then I was able to declassify a report from two of the men who survived. So two are captured and spend the war in a prisoner of war camp. One of them is killed on the landing. One of them is severely injured, and one survives and goes on to be really important in the X Troop. So I read their after action reports, where one of them says, we were sent on this like top secret raid to go to German headquarters, to go through documents and to take a German respirator, which I talked to all these German military historians. They're like, no, that's the Enigma. Because we already know from O'Keefe and others that very good chance this was also a raid for Enigma. And it just made perfect sense. Of course, then you're going to have a group of these German speakers. And then I found a report by one of Ian Fleming's, and Ian Fleming organized the whole Enigma grab, where he says, yeah, there was this group of these German speakers, and we gave them a bunch of cash and told them, go do this thing you need to do. So I have a lot of connections. One of them, Miriam Rothschild, I talked about earlier, she's married to the one who organizes the whole Dieppe thing. She's then working at Bletchley Park in the Navy hut where they're doing Enigma. So there's all of these sort of direct correlations. And it's sort of one of those things where you can't prove it, but there's no other way to understand it as far as I see.
Yeah. So, and that's one of the earlier operations, and they're involved in a lot of other things. But I know that the D-Day and the D-Day story is something that catches a lot of people's interest. We're going to be talking about that next week. And they have, some unique missions that they carry out prior to D-Day. And I'd like to kind of talk about that. And then there's the wonderful story about visiting somebody that they never thought they'd visit, that maybe you could...
This is a wonderful story. Actually, the Washington Post is writing a story on this next week for D-Day. So I'll highlight a bit of it. So in the days leading up to D-Day, again, it's pretty clear these guys are incredible, right? So Brian Hilton Jones is approached, can you pick like the best of the best? And one of his men is this guy, George Lane, the one who's married to Miriam Rothschild, who's working at Bletchley Park, who George Lane was on the Olympic water polo team for Hungary. He's one of the few Hungarians who's there, but he's fluent in German. They pick him to do a water sort of mission to land on the Normandy beaches. This was like 2 weeks before D-Day, to go and see if the Germans have a new type of mine, because there's rumors that they're going to use a new type of mine, and if the boats land there, everyone will be pulverized. So they hear about this rumor about this mine. They send George Lane there on a little boat to go bring back a mine. He goes on the first mission, and he comes back and he says, it's just it's a standard German teller mine. That's all it is, that you think is something else. They're not so sure. They send him a second time. He says again, it's a teller mine. And I think he brings one back with him. It's not clear, but he has proof on the second one. They send him a third time just to make 100% sure, because he's the man responsible for if there's going to be the D-Day landings as planned. He's captured the third time. A blindfold is put around him. He's driven in a car. He's really freaking out, as you would, because he's thinking, the SS or whatever this is, they're going to kill me. He keeps up his charade, though, that he's just like a Welsh soldier. He's doing a fake Welsh accent at this point.
And look, nobody knows what a Welsh accent is.
That was the idea.
Nobody knows. Even the Welsh people, I'm not convinced that they really know.
He was like, nobody knows. And maybe this little German ting to my voice, they'll think. So he's pretending all this. They take him, and he can see out of the side of his blindfold where he's being led. And they bring him to this really strange looking castle. And they bring him to a room. They say, young man, please clean yourself up. You have an important meeting. And he's like, what? What's going to happen here? Okay, so they actually have him clean his fingernails, and they give him something to eat. They bring him into this study, and it's Field Marshal Rommel himself who wants to interview this guy. And he ends up having tea with Rommel, and they discuss the war. It's all being fake Welsh.
Best pastries and
The guy has almost no idea this is like a Hungarian Jew talking to him. But the great thing is that when they, the conversation goes fine, Rommel writes a letter about it. Rommel's so charmed. He's incredibly charming. The other commandos called him the Hungarian hunk because he's really handsome and charming. And after it, Rommel decides not to kill him as a commando because he doesn't break his story enough. And I think he was really charmed by him. So then they send him to a prisoner of war camp. And of course, George Lane is looking out the side of his, and he can see exactly what the headquarters of Rommel looks like. So when he gets to the POW camp, within like a second, all the British suss it out and they think he's a stooge. And then he tells them the true story of the X Troop and stuff. And he says, I got to describe what Rommel's headquarters look like. And he describes it. And because the POW camp has a library in it, one of the officers says, oh my God, I know that weird castle. He runs to the library. He finds a book that has a sketch of this castle. And he says, is this the castle? He said, that's where Rommel's headquarters is. And then they send it by radio back to command. They have a secret radio, of course, in London. And like short time thereafter, like a couple months, while Rommel's driving, the RAF bombs him and he's out of the war. So there you go. Every chapter of the book was like this.
yeah.
Rommel's headquarters was at Roche Guyon, and it is a very unusual, kind of impressive looking place. Set up against the mountainside the way it is. So one can believe that somebody might have figured that out from a description of it. But also, don't you think this is kind of going away from your story for a moment, so please pardon me. But it always feels like Rommel and Patton end up in everybody's story, right? Like every GI, it seems like, has some story where they or their buddy or somebody they know.
I got to answer that. So that's really funny that you said that, because when I wrote the first draft of the book, I had a friend who's a German military historian read it, and he said, oh my God, are you kidding me? Another Rommel story? And by then I had like 10 factual points, primary sources. He's like, you got to add 5 more because everybody has a Rommel story. But I was like, this is true. So I understood that because that's what he said. Just one thing I forgot to say though, that in George Lane's, he gets a Victoria Cross or something. In his citation, it says something like, but for the actions of George Lane, the invasion would not have gone on as planned. So he was the one who gave them the information. So sorry.
And I wasn't meaning to cast any aspersions on George Lane.
No, it's true.
But I do think it's funny. There's always, everybody somehow met Rommel, or every German somehow met Rommel, every American somehow met Patton.
No,
and you're
true.
filtering out the ones that actually happened versus the ones that just kind of happened in somebody's imagination is a full-time job.
Actually, the one that I think is the most humorous is, so he's taken to a prison camp, and he goes in, and there are all these Tommies who've been there for Lord knows how long. He goes, no, really, you got to believe me. So after I had tea with Rommel, I went here, and I'm not really a stooge. I'm a Hungarian Jew posing as a Welshman, really.
Yeah. So that explains everything, right?
That explains everything.
And he's like the Peter Graves character from what's the Stalag movie?
Great Escape.
No, the one with oh my God, Holden. I'm dying here.
Never mind. Let's move on.
It's not important. Move on.
So there's all the stuff that happens before D-Day, but what is the role they play on D-Day? Because even again there, they have kind of a unique mission.
Yeah, so for D-Day, again, they're all set out in 2s and 3s in different groups, right? And they're all going to land at Sword Beach. Pretty much all of them are under the guide of Lord Lovett, because it's his broader commando unit. And a bunch of them, particularly one of the men, the guy from Vienna, who's this artistic guy we talked about earlier, Peter Masters, you can send the back slide. He's chosen literally as they're going to the dock in Southampton, right, to join the bicycle troop, another troop nobody knows anything about. But crazy enough, they created this thing called the bicycle troop, where they had these 50-pound bicycles. And remember, of course, as everyone knows, they also have like 50 pounds on their backs with ammunition and ropes and everything else. And he's very lucky because he actually doesn't drown when he lands. A number of them drown. They land at Sword Beach, And his group of the bicycle troop are given the mission to ride these clunky, awful bikes that don't even have pedals and are so awful that Peter Masters later said, whenever you ride them, you have to put your backpack on the front. And of course, your backpack will push down on the wheel and make it stop at that exact moment the sniper's in the church trying to kill you. So it was like, and another commander who saw them land said, there's nothing worse you could land with on D-Day than a bike. So these guys are all given a bike to go off of Sword Beach and to ride to Pegasus Bridge, believe it or not. So Stephen Ambrose, as I told Rick, interviewed some of the X-Troopers who were part of the bicycle troop. Right. And they ride ahead of everybody, ahead of Lord Lovett, everyone else, because they have to get to the bridge very quickly. And extraordinarily, Peter Masters, again, a Viennese Jew, is with that first group who make it over the bridge. And they get there, they let the guys know that the Allies are coming just to hold on to the bridge. And I also saw these letters between him and Lord Lovett afterwards where they discussed like this incredible role of the bicycle troop. And just to stay with Peter Masters in a second, because these boys were always there at the place that was so crucial, a few days later after the landing, it's going to be Peter Masters and a fellow X-Trooper who are there when Lord Lovett is hit by shrapnel, and they both save his life. And I read these letters from Lord Lovett about these guys who did that. But so they're all sent to hold different positions. And, you know, they're German, though. I'll just say one more thing about the landings at Sword Beach, because they're all landing at Sword Beach. But one of the groups lands to the side a little bit late. And the carnage when they land is absolutely horrific. And there's 2 X-Troopers with this group. And one of them, Mountford Gons, whose picture we showed earlier, is just so fearless and so focused. And he's been told, get off the beach. Everybody's been telling him to get off the beach. And he's kept it together. So when they land, unfortunately, half of the commando unit he's with are wiped out in the carnage of Sword Beach. But he remembers to run, and he runs forward up the beach. And because of his German and his training, and he was trained in counterintelligence at Cambridge as well, so he's really steely, he immediately captures 25 Germans. And he says to them in German, boys, you need to show us the way off the beach through the minefields. And they do. I mean, they must have been completely shocked. This guy in fluent German, wait, what? What's happening? And he leads the other half of the commando unit safely off the beach, and they make their way through France and capture villages and so on and so forth. But it's because they had this German and this training that they could do this right then, right there, and get into it.
I want to just say that 17 members of our audience have just told me that Stalag 17 is the movie that we were trying to think of, where William Holden is trying to get by,
right.
and Peter Graves, who later is Mr. Mission Impossible, is the German stooge who has slipped into the camp there. So I don't know why it's important to let you know that, Leah, but I feel
can sleep
like
easy tonight.
Yeah,
I feel like I have done that job, and that's really appropriate. So these guys are involved with all sorts of different stuff throughout the war. And struck by this, they are obviously, as you say, they're kind of at the tip of the spear, and they're there when the British Army goes to Germany. And this is their homeland, right? This is where they grew up. This is, for many of them, all they knew until they suddenly were put on trains to Holland or sent off to England. So what was it like for these guys being involved with, liberating death camps, witnessing the devastation? I mean, it must have been extraordinary emotional turmoil for many of them.
That's a great question. Look, by the time they all get to the Rhine, right? They're all with these other commando units. So crossing the Rhine, one of them said it was the X-Troopers who were always they were now chosen to do everything first because they were so competent. Some of them felt very reluctant to go back because of what had happened there. Others, though, many of them, like Ian Harris is one I talk about in the book, said, man, I was excited. I'm going to cross the Rhine and kill myself some Nazis. And he crosses the Rhine and ends up being immediately in a battle with a group of Hitler youth. And, I mean, grabs his Tommy gun, runs straight at them, kills scores of them, captures scores. He also gets a military medal, for which they said, we've never seen anyone this brave. And, one Tommy gun is empty, he grabs another, like, it's crazy stuff. But for some of them, it was just incredibly emotional. Montfort Gons again, when he crosses over, he goes to Borken, the place where he was raised. And as they move through and they get to his old town, he said something like, he wrote a letter to his girlfriend that I read that said something like, man, I was going through all these German towns that were flattened, and it was great to see it. And when he gets back to his town of Borken, Germany, he's walking the streets of Germany now as a British commando. And it's after the war that he's going to be sent back there to be in charge of the denazification efforts in Borken. So all this stuff is really personal. They're all kept for denazification in 45 and 46 to go back. And so when he goes back to his town of Borken, he knows who the goodies are and who the baddies are. He knows the biology teacher who used to abuse the Jewish kids. He also knows the mayor who tried to hide Jewish families. And so now he's put in charge of Borken for the denazification efforts to right the world that's gone so wrong. So it was like extraordinarily personal, all of this, but none of it, unlike Inglourious Basterds, that movie, none of this was about revenge. They followed the rules of war. They were incredibly ethical. I was contacted by a professor at West Point who said, we're going to actually use some of their stories to teach our men. Because, like, can you imagine how deep it is when you're, like, interrogating somebody who could have been potentially responsible for the death of your family? What do you do? But honestly, for the majority of them, they were psyched to get back there and, like, fix this terrible, terrible thing that had happened.
But in reading their diaries and their letters and talking to their families, did they ever comment on how they had to deal with that? Because, I mean, to keep that much justifiable rage in check must have been...
Yeah, well, Montfort Gans, his parents are taken away to Bergen-Belsen and then Theresienstadt concentration camp, which is a whole other part of the book that you have to read the book to see, but he decides he's going to rescue his own parents. As do a number of them, Ron Gilbert decides he's going to rescue his sister. And I will just give it away a little bit to say my book is weirdly optimistic. It's like a really optimistic World War II story, I would say. But for these guys, they saw there was a mission at hand. They had to suppress their feelings. They all talked about, like, suppressing what it was like. And then after the war, I think typical of many of this generation, they didn't talk about it. They didn't go there with their kids. Many of them never, ever changed their names back. And so when I wrote the book, I had all this archival material from war diaries and all the stuff from the museums and stuff like that. And for many of their kids, they said, reading the book, because the book just came out this week, so they've started to read it, they found out all the stuff about their dads never told them, that they never... It was a place they weren't going to go with their kids or themselves potentially. So, I mean, one of the two commandos I interviewed made me promise in the book I would only use a pseudonym for him because he'd never told anybody that he was like a Holocaust survivor. His parents had been taken. He was from Germany and he lived like under the British name he became when he was like 18 when he joined the X Troop. And that was pretty typical for them, that it was too painful a place and they weren't gonna. So even in the interviews, they don't talk about it. That psychological aspect.
Well, and I want to get to a question we had from the audience, but I'm also just thinking that you must have been challenged sometimes since you have to remember two names for everybody.
Yeah, that was a big editorial thing. I went through my editor, like 500 jobs. What name should we use? The decision in the end in the book, though, was to appreciate the agency of these men, and I decided that the name I would give you all their both names at the back, but the name I chose to call them in the book was the name they chose to be after the war. So if you become Colin Anson, to be an ex-trooper, that's the name I'm going to use in the book, though I'll tell you what his real name was.
Sure. So we have a question from Wally, one of our viewers, who says, with so much to fix in Germany, did many of them stay to rebuild that country, or did they return to Britain? And I would add, because there are other choices here, or where did they go? And tell us some of the post-war story, which is another fascinating part of this.
Yeah, so none of them are naturalized until quite a few years after the war. They're all technically enemy aliens, but the British military decides to use all of them who will do it for the denazification effort. So all of them after the war, pretty much all the survivors end up in Germany and Austria, rooting out Nazis, interrogating high officials for the Nuremberg trials. They were completely crucial towards the denazification efforts. After 46, when most of them are demobbed, they either stay in the UK, which is where most of them stay, or quite a large number come to the United States and Canada. And a small handful return to Germany and become really sort of important in the German government after the war. But the vast majority either stay in the UK or go to America or Canada. A lot of people have asked me, did they go to Israel? And my answer is, God, these boys just wanted a quiet life. They really did. I mean, they were all like leaders of industry and extraordinary lives, but they, Maurice Latimer, who's like this Superman in my book, I interviewed one of his kids' nieces, and she said, after all that, he was at Dieppe. He was the survivor at Dieppe. He worked as like a pharmacist assistant. He just wanted some peace. So they don't go to Israel. They go to the United States, they go to Canada, or they stay in the UK.
Well, but one of the things I was curious about, you've revealed the story for the people here in Britain and much more so for the people in America. Is this story known in Israel?
The book is being translated into Hebrew, so the story will be known soon in Israel. But I did have one talk in which one of the sort of people in the audience was sort of upset that I was telling the story. And he said, well, what about the Jewish Brigade? But I don't know if you know about the Jewish Brigade, but this was sort of this weird ad hoc thing they threw together that fought a little bit in Italy. It didn't really get anything done. So I don't think anyone knows this story because it was secret, and it was really complicated because all the men are parceled out to different units. So like, I had to go to every different war diary for every unit rather than like the X Troop war diary. So it was a huge story to tell that hasn't been told. So the Times of Israel is going to do a big article. It's going to be translated into Hebrew. And I do think it's important for Israelis also to realize, like, we had some fierce Jewish warriors who were who were fighting for the British. Absolutely. Yep.
Well, I want to, Leah Garrett, I want to thank you for joining us on History Happy Hour, and thank you for telling this story in your book, X Troop, The Secret Jewish Commandos of World War II. And I also want to mention that you wrote a Memorial Day op-ed piece for CNN, which people can find on CNN, but more importantly, they can find it on the History Happy Hour Facebook page. So you can read Leah's op-ed piece and see a little glimpse of the story that she tells in the book X Troop. So Leah, thank you so much for joining us from your cabin in Peekskill with all the amazing stuff there on the wall. In hour two, if we had an hour two, we would ask you about all that stuff, but we'll let it go for now. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much, gentlemen.
Thanks, guys. Good luck.
Thank you very much.
All right.
Chris, we should probably talk a little bit about next week, which is June 6th. So something, what was it?
I don't know.
June 6th, there's some kind of thing.
It was a very long, that's such a long day. I don't know.
It's the longest day,
right? I slipped that in there.
So next Sunday is June 6th, and that is our D-Day special where we're going to blow it all out. We're going to go 90 minutes plus. I'm going to be live from the National D-Day Memorial. And we're going to have on as our first guest, because we have multiple guests that day.
Lots of guests, yes.
We are going to have on Giles Milton, who is the author of this wonderfully titled book, Soldier, Sailor, Frogman, Spy, How the Allies Won on D-Day. So I have to read this week How the Allies Won on D-Day. And then, Chris, what are we going to do after we have talked to Giles for a while? What's going to happen?
Well, Giles is going to we're going to be joined by two History Happy Hour alumni. They couldn't wait to come back. Craig Simons, who is, as you may know, the author of Operation Neptune, amongst other books, and an authority on the naval aspects of D-Day, and also Joe Balkowski, who is, as far as I'm concerned, the dean of the American effort on June 6th and D-Day, and we're going to have a terrific opportunity to talk about The Longest Day, D-Day, and D-Day controversies. So
D-Day controversies.
these historians are going to talk to us about the things that they always get asked, or the questions that people always put to them, and their take on that. So
Stuff
it should
that
be.
they want to stick their own knife
Yes.
into and kill forever. But
That's
D-Day
right.
controversies, and that is so we're excited about that show. So please come back next week and tell everybody who might be interested to come back and join us for the D-Day special. And I want to just mention in our final closing moments here that for those of you who are true gluttons for punishment, true gluttons for punishment. Do you have your glass ready, Chris?
I do.
Okay,
Yeah.
yeah. That I am going to be on C-SPAN tonight
Oh,
at 8
isn't that
p.m.
cool?
to talk about the Ghost Army. So that
See.
is on C-SPAN. Raise your glass at 8 p.m. tonight to talk about the Ghost Army. So I'm kind of excited about that. And
You look younger in that picture, Rick.
that is a great picture taken by my great friend Timothy John Smith, who is getting married on August 21st. So we're excited about that also.
So you're going
lots
to become so famous, you could say you knew him when.
he's an actor too. He's been in a
No,
lot of
you.
movies.
You're gonna be
no,
so
No,
famous.
he's way more famous. I'm never going to be famous. I'm super famous now. How could I get more famous?
Because
than I
that's
already
true.
am? Yeah.
That's true.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Happy. Be safe.